Problems of definition. Having briefly introduced Australian literature let's look at some of the problems associated with trying to answer the question, what's Australian literature? How do we define Australian literature? This is not an easy task as different people have different definitions of it in different contexts. The difficulty of defining Australian literature is connected to the problems of giving clear, simple definitions to the terms Australian and literature both separately and together. The reason why these difficulties arise are because the meaning of these terms keep on changing with the time and with different contexts. Many people take it for granted that literature should be studied with the nation as a primary context and framework of reference. Bennett and Strauss. One of the important reasons for this is that the nature and themes of literature are influenced by and in turn influence contemporary social and political realities. Since for a long time the category of the nation has been seen as a unit in social, political, cultural, and historical terms, the study of literature has been linked to it. The study of literature has thus become deeply related to the way national identity is created and presented. The nature of both the nation and the literary storytelling or narration connected to it are constantly changing. The definitions and content of both the nation and its literature change as social and political conditions change, demanding similar changes in the way both are presented. This situation is seen in the case of Australian literature as well. In the introduction to the Oxford Literary History of Australia, the editors Bruce Bennett and Jennifer Strauss make a comment about the wide and changing range in the presentation of Australia in its literature. According to them, the images of the country includes many things. There are images from an Aboriginal dreaming describing how the world came into existence according to Aboriginal folklore. There are the pre-discovery European imaginings of Australia as Terra Australis Incognita, an empty and unknown land. There are also experiences recorded by early settlers, which vary from paradisiacal to purgatorial. More recently, the literature has also revealed shift from the sense of a white Australia or Australia for Australians of Western Europe to the more recent notion of Australia as part of Asia. Many of these representations operate at times well beyond the confines of the national. The land now known as Australia had been occupied for several thousands of years before the British invasion and eventual colonization of the island continent. Often, that past of the land and the peoples who lived there before the colonizers came is hidden when Australian history and literature is presented as having its beginnings only in the past 200 years during which the colonizers have been there. This way of presenting Australian history and literature was connected to the legal misrepresentation of the Australian land as being terra nullius, that is, an empty land that could therefore be claimed and legally possessed by the colonizers without any consideration for any earlier claims by aborigines who lived there before. This kind of presentation of the civilization, culture, and contribution of the aborigines as not existing was a colonial act that for a long time left the aborigines outside or on the margins of discussions of Australia as a nation. This way of thinking about Aborigines is increasingly being challenged by and on behalf of the Aboriginal people. The Aborigines are telling their own stories and histories of the Australian nation and making them available for everyone. They are also laying claims to the legal possession of the land. Later waves of immigrants from southern Europe and Asia, as well as other groups silenced by the powerful colonial version of Australian identity, history, and literature, are also producing histories and literatures. These versions question the traditional presentation of the Australian nation as a nation created by white colonizers, mostly from Britain. All this is forcing people to take a new look at what has traditionally been considered Australian literature and make it include texts and voices it had earlier ignored. Within traditional white Australian literature itself, the idea of what constituted the Australianness of Australian literature was a point of debate. This became especially marked as the people of the Australian settler colonies tried to define both, especially marked as the people of the Australian settler colonies tried to define both for themselves and others the nature of their political, social, cultural, and literary relationship with the former colonial center Britain. At least two positions became important in the early decades of the 20th century. One argued that truly great literature had to follow the rules and traditions of the literary models of British and European literature, as these were universal and eternal. The other position argued that the distinctive features of Australian literature should express the tendency to define Australia without using Britain as a reference point or model. So, turning captures the sense of urgency felt at the point in history to define the Australian nation as different from Britain through literature when he quotes Natty Palmer from Modern Australian Literature 1924. Australia was no longer a group of more or less important colonies hanging loosely together on the ample bosom of Britannia. Australia was henceforth Australia. What that name was to mean, it lay in the hands of her writers above all to discover. This sense of urgency was, however, complicated by the problem of the actual nature of the difference which Australian literature was supposed to present. If Australia and its literature were to be defined in terms of their differences with Britain and its literature, it was not very clear which areas of difference would be focused upon. Would it be the real and very obvious differences seen in the land, or differences in the spirit of the people that were more difficult to define and describe? Either way, both sets of differences were constructed and depended on whatever aspects the writer consciously chose to focus on: the land, the people, their spirit, or a combination of these three. Another aspect of this whole effort of creating a distinct national identity was the two-way pull of wanting to cut loose from Britain while still desiring to retain its respect, interest, and recognition. Literature was supposed to perform the function of creating national images that projected a national identity. This national identity was marked by a sense of distinction and a sense of national pride in its differences from the British identity. Australia wanted to be more than just another colony or just an imitation of Britain. Ian Turner, just above, I wanted to read, but it was said so I didn't read. Ian Turner quotes T.Z. Tucker from The Cultivation of Literature in Australia, 1902. If we ever have an Australian school of literature, it will not be because of the fauna and flora and geography and idioms of Australia which may be introduced. These make nothing in art. It will be because our Australian atmosphere, our national life, occupations, religious ideas have inevitably and unconsciously created in our eyes and hearts and intellect some difference in our way of regarding things, so that we pursue strength and beauty and pathos in some new light and adapt our representation thereto. At any nation attempts to tell its stories through literature and history, the nature of the identity that the nation wishes to present defines the standards that decide what is considered valuable and authentic within those literary and historical representations. The nature of the target audience of those literary and historical representations will also determine the tone and content. For example, when the writers who belong to the group of the European settlers wrote with the audience in the metropolitan center of Britain and Europe in mind for a long time, the emphasis was on the exotic and bizarre in the new land. The inverted seasons were summer peaked in December and winter in June. Trees that shed their bark instead of their leaves, and animals like the kangaroo were presented as points of fascinating interest. Later on, when publications and primary reading audience shifted to Australia, the emphasis shifted as well. The focus was on creating a white Australian settlers identity through the rather repetitive literary creation of characters, themes, and situations that were symbols of the identity. The myths of the Australian bush and the culture of the bush life developed in a big way during this period. Now, the boundaries of the reading public and the publishing industry have expanded to include the voices and points of view of previously ignored and marginalized groups such as the Aborigines, immigrants, and women. As a result, there is more diversity in the set of historical and literary representations available in Australia. Australia, the nation with its many cultural, political, and social aspects, and Australian literature, the body of writing that have been used to present some aspects of the nation and its sense of identity have always and continue to be constantly changing. Australian literature is thus a term used to categorize a constantly changing body of writing and not any fixed set of books or ideas. There is no simple answer to the question, what is Australian literature? Just as there are no simple answers to these questions. To this question, what is Australian? Or what is literature? Because of these reasons, it would be harder still to attempt to define Australian literature in the traditional terms of certain characteristic features or any recognized canon or set of books that are considered great literature. So, so this is all about what is Australian literature and how do we define Australian literature. So if you like, please subscribe my channel.